Mr. Knotek, as a MEP and a rapporteur on climate, what led you to bring the topic of nanoplastics to the floor of the European Parliament?
It was mainly the current situation in the European Union, where everyone is focused on the idea that the only reasonable climate measure, according to the majority in Brussels, is to reduce emissions in Europe at all costs and as quickly as possible. Yet today, we already know from studies, and today's conference is proof of that, for which I am glad, that there are simply more elements affecting climate stability and contributing to climate change. One of them, for instance, is nanoplastics in the environment. Moreover, it links to the topic of health. So, precisely at the moment when I realized that a large part of the European Parliament refuses to admit that there could be other factors, other elements causing climate change, I told myself, yes, this is the right moment. Let's organize a series of conferences. We started with today's, and I am glad it was a success.
Did you enjoy the conference? Is there a specific moment that stood out to you or caught your interest the most?
One always tries, besides the strictly technical details. I am a chemical engineer by training, so I am somewhat professionally inclined in that I enjoyed even the relatively technical side. The level of the scientists was truly high. But one always tries to gain some takeaways, those small details. And what absolutely stunned me the most today is that for an adult, or a middle-aged person like myself, it is possible to have a volume of plastic in your brain equivalent to a plastic teaspoon. Of course, it is distributed via nanoplastics throughout various parts. So it is possible that today, almost every 35 or 40-year-old citizen in the world carries microplastics in their head equal to the size of a teaspoon, which obviously forces one to think about it. The second thing that really resonated with me is that nanoplastics already affect the course of pregnancy. A human being is affected by nanoplastics even before they are born, because they enter the placenta and reach developing life. Naturally, this is a new phenomenon that humanity hasn't fully familiarized itself with yet. And likely, in the future, understanding it, researching it, and implementing measures to help reduce this will play a significant role.
What do you think about the link between nanoplastics and the climate, potentially even climate change?
It is a complex issue. And that is exactly what politicians, especially in Brussels, sometimes lack. Today they deal with health. Tomorrow they deal with climate. Yet we have these cross-cutting issues, and the topic of micro and nanoplastics falls exactly into this category. Today's conference brought many interesting insights into how nanoplastics in the environment don't just enter animals and humans, and potentially affect their immunity against, for example, bacterial diseases and so on, but also how they can act in the sea, how they can affect the absorption of greenhouse gases. When you connect all of this, you have a complex problem. For me, this wasn't entirely news. It was one of the reasons why we organized this conference. But I am really glad we were able to connect nanoplastics across health and climate, as not everyone is able to think about it in this way.
The conference was indeed packed with information. As a politician, what do you see as the next step?
Clearly, the topic needs to be kept on the table. There are many topics out there. Many politicians also don't like to change the subject. Meaning, those who have been telling you for 10 or more years that we must close all power plants and factories as quickly as possible to save the planet will suddenly be reluctant to hear that there are other factors in the climate. So, just fighting for a place at the table is a challenge. There are truly many topics, even in the field of health itself. Most areas focus on cancer or cardiovascular diseases. I remember, not to deviate too much, but in the last term, we managed to bring up the topic of chronic kidney disease, and it was a huge success that people suddenly started talking about it. There is simply limited space for attention, and there are many seekers of that attention, and consequently, of funding. So definitely to maintain the momentum of this topic. The European Union, to stay in Brussels, recently prepared legislation to limit plastic pellets and their handling. It is, let's say, a step in the right direction. But in the context of the information we learn today, it is insufficient. This means gaining support in all directions, at the level of politicians, MEPs, ministers, but also the professional public. I want to thank everyone who managed to come from all across Europe to today's conference. Truly, many European states were represented, and of course, there were speakers from the United States. So we need to involve not just politicians, but also civil society as much as possible. And thank you for what you are doing.
We thank you for giving space to such an important topic as nanoplastics. One more question comes to mind. Is there anyone whom this topic does not affect? What is your opinion?
Well, I always try to answer very precisely. I can immediately imagine, for example, Eskimos living in truly isolated parts in the north of Sweden, in the wilderness. There, the exposure is certainly lower than elsewhere. We learned ourselves that there is a difference in concentrations in the oceans. For example, in the Mediterranean, the concentration of nanoplastics is significantly higher than even in places where there are currently huge loads of floating bottles in the ocean. So the distribution of exposure definitely varies. And I believe there are places where it hardly applies, but there probably won't be many. And I fear we are in a trend where it will affect more and more people, essentially everyone on this planet.
Can you imagine the European Union being able to solve this problem alone?
This problem is entirely global. Success is not possible here without coordinated action and coordinated awareness. And that is precisely Europe's problem. Europe says, okay, we will do it alone first, and everyone will follow us. And because they don't do it smartly, no one follows, and Europe only ends up hurting itself. On the contrary, we need to utilize, let's say, the transatlantic bonds. I am extremely glad that Pastor Burns, who works with Donald Trump, spoke here. This means that both the European and American administrations consider the topic important, and that is a good foundation for other geopolitical powers, such as China and India, to take notice. Because, of course, without the cooperation of India, we are unable to achieve a global effect.
Thank you for the interview.
Thank you for having me.